Hello everybody, I hope you're all having an amazing day. It is Wednesday, which means we're doing our usual Wednesday little lesson. And carrying on from last week, where we covered the Scotch game, I felt we would do another opening today. And today, we're doing one for black. It's one of my favourite ones. It's the Scandinavian, but it's not just any Scandinavian. It is knight f6 after e takes d4. So the Scandinavian itself is e4, d5. And then e takes d5. So there are a few other things they can do before we get to the knight f6 part. Firstly, they could push, at which point you play c5. And you play this sort of like a better version of the French. You can get your light squared bishop out, which is a big problem in the French, is that your light squared bishop's stuck sort of behind your pawns. So you need to sort of force its way out. So it's just a better version of the French, really, and it goes into a lot of the similar sort of... I said you get your bishop out first. It goes into a lot of the similar sorts of pawn structures. And it's just a nice game for black, basically. The other thing they could do is play d4. Now, this is a completely wild one, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about this one because... it's too much for one video. It needs its own thing. It probably needs a series, to be honest. It's called the Blackmar Damer Gambit, and it can come from d4, d5, or it can come from the Scandinavian. And basically, you just take this. You can play e6 and play this like a French, but there are some other gambits they can do with like a bishop d3. Which are super interesting, but you just take this, and especially if they play bishop g5 here, this is called the Von Popular Gambit. Super deadly. Please be careful with this because yeah, it can go very wrong very quickly for black. Yeah, so that's one other thing they can do. Knight c3 is another thing, and this one's quite nice. You should be sort of happy if they play this. You just play d4. The knight goes back to e2, and then e5. And you sort of want to lock this up. You'll feel happy if they play d3. And what you sort of want is your pieces out. You want a queenside castle, really. And you just want to throw everything at their castle king, basically. And that's the plan. And it's super nice for black because you've got the space at the start. And they've messed around moving a few of their pieces to places they don't really want to go. Knight f3 is another choice. This is called the Tennyson Gambit. You might have seen this if you watched my opening trap video. It's not very good for white. It's not very good for white, but it is. There are some traps. There are some really tricky traps, actually. But you can just take this. You'll have to sort of look it up on your own or watch my opening traps video for a bit more detail. But you can just take this pawn. It's not too bad if you sort of know what you're doing. And then we've covered e5 as well. So that's everything else they can do before you play this knight f6 line. But we'll just say they take, which is what they're going to do, basically. You play the Scandi, you take the pawn. That's sort of the rule. So the mainline Scandinavian is queen takes d5 here. And this is perfectly fine. In fact, it's probably a bit more playable at a top level. But to be honest, the computer evaluation is practically the same. And here you just get chased around with the knight. You can go to a few places here. Queen a5 is the main one. You can go back all over the shop, everywhere, basically. And it's an okay one for black if you like it. But I think knight f6 is a super interesting little opening here. And the whole point is you've temporarily gambited a pawn. Now, I say gambit. In 99% of the lines, you will take this pawn back practically straight away. In fact, white will just give you the pawn back. There are a few lines where it does stay a gambit, but those are fine. They're not too complicated. So, yeah, you go knight f6, and the whole point is that you want to take this pawn back with the knight rather than the queen. You don't want to mess around getting your queen kicked about that much. Which is the downside of the Scandinavian, is that your queen gets kicked out. See, if we go back to this main line, They play like a d4, c6, bishop out. And you can see now after this knight moves, it's going to be a discovered attack from the bishop. So it just sort of avoids these sort of lines. And what happens now? That's the question. And there are kind of a lot of things white can do here. We'll start off with the most obvious. It's d4, and they just give the pawn back, basically. Now, if you really, really want to, you can take this with the queen. But what's the point of playing knight f6 if you're going to take back with the queen? So we take back with the knight here. And yeah, there's a few things white can sort of do. You play the knights out, either one. And that sort of transposes into the other lines, which we'll cover. But what you're going to see most of the time is c4. And now, if you really want, you can be a bit tricky, but I would recommend not. And just going back to knight f6, which just sort of continues. You play it like a c4, try to break up this pawn structure a bit. If they take, you're fine. You just trade off the queens, and you're good. You've doubled their pawns. If they ignore it, you're happy taking, and you can develop with tempos on the queen and such. If they push, you break it up again with e6, and eventually they'll take it, and you just take it with the bishop. And you've got a nice game. You've developed your pieces, and it's just good. It's not bad for both players, and that's the thing I sort of like and dislike about this opening. It gets out of a lot of the tactical stuff. It's very similar to the Scotch, in a way that you're breaking the tension immediately. So yes, you get out of all the tricks and all the pressure that you get as black. But then again, your opponent also has a slightly easier game as well. So it's double-edged in the way that you've got to sort of fight to have tactics and all that and winning positions. You've got to earn the winning positions from this. But then again, you don't easily fall into losing positions. So that's the sort of the double-edged side about this opening, which is completely fine. So if you want to be a bit more risky here, after c4, you can try knight to b4. Now this looks like it just immediately loses a piece, and this is called the Marshall-Kiel variation, and it's a super tricky trap, and the whole point is queen a4. And does this not just lose a piece? You bring the knight back, they push the pawn. You bring this knight up, they push the pawn, and it's pinned. Doesn't that not just lose a piece? And no is the answer, basically. You play knight c6 anyway. And yeah, they're going to play d5. But honestly, you are happy with this. Because you have this super cool move, b5. Absolutely wild. And you might think, what if queen takes? Well, if queen takes, well, you actually just have this rook fork. And that's your immediate compensation right there. So pawn takes, and then you go ahead and do this really tricky move, knight to d4. What? Does that not just hang the knight? Actually, no, because then you have a fork, and it's even worse because you're hitting both the king, the queen, and the rook as well, which is wild. So what they could do here, they could throw in a check, which is fine. But bishop d7, you're actually hitting the queen, so you're actually going to get this fork off. But knight a3 is the way to go. Just immediately stopping that with the queen and the knight both covering this forking square. And then you play e5. So this is supporting the knight. And it's supporting this knight as well from the bishop. And they're going to try to take en passant. At which point you just take back with the bishop. And you're just developing. You see you're developing. You're down one pawn. All your pieces are still safe. This check's not doing anything at all, really. In fact, we can see what the computer says here. It's saying actually just go back to bishop d7. And the queen has to go to d1. And then you just keep going. Bishop f5 and you add another attacker. So it's fine. But bishop e3 is the right move. Which looks a bit tricky. Like you're hitting the knight and causing some sort of disturbance. But queen h4 is actually a really interesting move. So firstly, if the bishop decides to take, you can just take this with the queen. And now you can see maybe a long castles is super scary. But then you also have this threat of a knight d3 check. And you're actually winning this queen. So it's super, super scary. You've got potentially a check and then a bishop check afterwards as well, which is woo. And it looks super nice. So the way to go actually from here is long castles. And this is just sort of better for black, to be honest. They could do some other things, like check here now and such. But I think a lot of the people are going to long castle just to sort of get out of the way of these dangerous sort of checks, you know. So if they long castles, you should be super happy with this, because you're going to get a good position. Now, this is sort of where I'm going to stop it for now, because there's so many things you can do as black, and they mostly revolve around either checkmating or winning the queen. For example, I just put this one in, knight e2 check. Obviously, if bishop takes, then you have check either way to win the queen. And if the king moves, you have this bishop check, and then the knight check, and the queen just takes the knight, and you're like 2 pieces for a queen. So it's just good for you. But yeah, it gets super, super tricky. And it looks good. It looks good, but that's only if they fall for it. So what they're going to do here instead is just go a3. That's the way to stop it, basically. And what are you doing here? Knight c6, sure, and then you just get kicked about, and you keep getting kicked about, and it's not particularly nice. So you just down a lot of development, and it's playable. I've actually played this line in a classical game, and it's not bad at all. Maybe a knight a6, the computer's saying, is a bit better. But it's not bad. It's just you're giving your opponent a lead in development. So that's the downside of this trap. If they don't go for it, if they don't go for this queen a4 check, then you're giving them a lead in development. So it might be worth it. It depends if you think your opponent's going to fall for it or not, or if you want to risk it or not. But if they do, you should be super, super happy if you remember the moves, because the moves can get a bit tricky to memorize. But yeah, that is this d4 line. Okay, so what else can they do here? What else can they do? What else have we got? Knight c3 is a line. Knight c3 is a line. At this point, you're obviously not going to take back with the queen, so you just take with the knight. And there's 2 things white can do here. Bishop c4 is the main one. And now you can play a couple things. The computer's recommending e6, and that's probably actually the way to go. There is a little trap you can do on bishop to e6 instead. If they play something silly like knight f3, knight takes knight, you've uncovered this attack on the bishop, and you're actually hitting the queen at the same time. So they have to take, at which point you just get a free piece. But no one's going to fall for that. So just go e6 instead. They can do queen f3 or knight f3. If they do knight f3, you just take the knight. Easy stuff. And you just play on. You've got to work a bit to get this light squared bishop active, but it's just an equal game, really. If they go queen f3, you've got a few nice moves, actually. You can go knight back to b6. This bishop's hanging. That's the point. You're attacking the bishop. So the bishop goes back to b3. And then a5 is a serious threat. a5, looking to actually trap the bishop. Where's the bishop going? So they're more than likely going to play a4. They could play a3, I guess, just to give them an escape square rather than stopping your pushing pawn. But this is just a bit of a waste of a move for you, for them. Sorry. So a4 is probably the better way to go. And you can play this on however you want, really, like a bishop e7, bishop d7. They're both fine, and it's perfectly playable. But the computer's recommending this really cool line, knight to a6. And this is wild. This is really wild. So your whole point is that you're actually going knight to c5, just hunting this bishop. And if they're not careful, they're actually losing this pawn. So if they do something weird like a d3, freeing up this bishop, then a knight to c5 is actually just winning a pawn. They could let you take the bishop, then this pawn's isolated, and this a5 pawn's actually doing a really good job of holding up any pawn pushes coming their way. So they'll go back and actually just give up the pawn, which is a bit weird, but it's still perfectly even, because a passed side pawn, it's not even passed, it's just like an extra side pawn. It's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. But yeah, any sort of idea is going to work. Here it's saying Queen H5 is the best move, which looks completely wild, hitting tons of stuff. But I think something along the lines of a D push is more likely, to be honest. Yeah, so the other thing they could do is knight takes d5. And if you see this, you should be like immediately happy, basically. And you're just going to take back with the queen. And now you basically have a mainline Scandinavian, except they can't actually kick you about anymore. So you've just got a really, really active queen for no bad sides, no downsides at all. Knight f3, you just match it. They're going to play a d4 just to claim some space, otherwise they're going to get completely steamrolled. And the computer probably suggests bishop f5, but I would say bishop g4 is probably a bit more playable at a lower level. There's a few more tactics stuff. You just have to be careful of castles and bishop takes with check. That's one thing you really have to be careful, because that's quite scary. So you're going to long castle no matter what, basically. And you just pile in a ton of pressure on this pawn. Now they castle, and you just take this pawn. And now you're up a pawn, basically. You've got a free pawn. It's still nice, and it's still probably it's still even. But yeah, after trades, you just up the pawn. White is quite active. Surprisingly, they can get things out pretty quickly, and you have to be ready for that. But it's just a nice position, and there's not much tension on the board. The other thing they can do is, rather than castles, go like bishop e3, at which point you need to remember e5 is the way to go. Now, if they take this with the knight, you can take e2 after queen takes, knight takes, pawn takes, and you're actually taking this g2 pawn at the end of it. So that's the whole point, is that knight's actually pinned to the g2 pawn. Where are we? Bishop e3. Bishop e3. Bishop e3, there we go, e5. And yeah, you're just looking to sort of trade off. They might try like a castles here, and then just e takes is all good. Stuff trades off. Like I said, takes with check is something you've got to be aware of. But like a knight e6 here is fine. They do have the bishop pair, so you've got to be a bit aware of that. But yeah, it's a nice position. It's a nice position. I like especially the doubled queen and rook. I think that causes a lot of problems that white needs to be very aware of. So d4. So we've seen knight c3. We've seen d4. What else is there? Knight f3 is a move they can do. So this is probably what you'll see at a higher level. You just take this pawn, and it's just solid. You know, white has the spatial advantage, and you just sort of develop your pieces in the same sort of way. They could play like a c4 here, but it's all the same really. They're going to play that no matter what. c4. If you've got your bishop out, you're happy to go to b4. There's no, you've got the same sort of threats if the queen comes in and checks, and then you play e6 as soon as you can just to cover this knight. So you're all good on that front. So knight a6 and then just e6, yeah. But bishop e2, e6, and then you basically have the same setup no matter what. The bishop sort of wants to go to f6 rather than the knight, which is sort of interesting, but you are hitting this pawn. Maybe you play a c5 instead. C5, knight c6, sorry. Maybe the knight comes back to b6 as well. And you just have a nice sort of endgame. Yeah, this bishop really does want to be on f6, and I found that in a game, if I can get my bishop onto f6, it's a super nice position and super easy to play for me. But white has the space, and that's the problem you have as black here. You just have to really work to claim that central space. But after knight f3, there isn't much to it. It all sort of goes the same way basically, and it transposes a lot from the d4 lines as well. If they don't play c4 straight away, it often does transpose. So what else do we have here? What else do we have? c4 is the other choice. C4 is the other choice. Now c4 is my least favorite of the lines because it forces black into a gambit. Basically, it forces black into a gambit. And if you're not comfortable playing gambits, do not play this line. Because this is a forced gambit. You have to gambit a pawn here. And it's what I would actually recommend if you were to play against this as white. Because it's after e4 and d5, I would recommend taking an after knight f6. C4 is a very solid choice. It's basically calling the bluff on whether they are good enough to play this or not. And there's two things black can actually do here. The first one we'll look at is e6, and this is called the Icelandic palm gambit, or just the Icelandic gambit, at which point you just take the pawn. And I don't recommend playing this as black, unless you really want to and you know the line super well. I wouldn't recommend it. The problem I have with it, and I've played this, this used to be my main line before I switched to the other one. The reason I don't play it anymore is because I feel like it's very much like a one-line, sort of one-trick pony, you know. And if they don't do it, if they don't do this one trap, you're sort of in the mud a bit. I know people do play this at a high level, and they would obviously know more than me. So if you want to know this, probably go speak to them, watch their videos and stuff. But I would just say avoid this if you have the choice, basically. And instead, play c6. So you just gambit the other pawn, basically. And this, I think, is nicer, because I think your knights are a bit better than getting a bishop out, because the bishop's already sort of developed. You know, there's not much difference between the c8 and the e6 square. But getting your knight out with a tempo is going to be quite nice. So they're probably just going to take this. They can actually play d4 here, and after c takes. This is just the Panov. It's just the Caro-Kann Panov. And it's you just have to know the Panov. It's quite easy to play, to be honest. So you don't need that much theory on it. But do be aware that it is just the Panov. So after they take, your knight takes. And then there are more things they can do here. Most likely it's going to be one of the knights. The main line is actually knight f3. At which point you play e5. And e5 is the whole idea of this gambit. You're trying to claim space, and you're stopping this pawn getting to d4. So where is the pawn going to go? It's going to go to d3. And that's actually the main line here, is d3. And then you have the whole reason why you've played e5 as well, is to push e4. Now, there's a few things they can do here. Queen e2 immediately loses, basically. Computer saying bishop b4 check, knight c3, bishop f5. You're looking at just looking after this pawn. And there's some tricks you can do, maybe even pinning the knight and then going knight to b4 is an idea, but it's just completely winning for black. And I don't think you really need that much theory to sort of work this one out. It's just a nice position, basically. But they're going to take. They could also go knight to g5, which is just super nice as well. Bishop g4, and then you're hitting the queen. They'll go like a c3 maybe, or even a bishop e2. At which point you can take, after queen takes, you get this pawn back, basically. That's the whole idea. But yeah, they're going to take, basically. That's the whole point. They're going to take. At which point you trade the queens, and then you've kicked the king out. The kings are in the wide open. And the knights are going to come in and try harass the king, basically. And that's the idea. So you take the pawn, and you see immediately this is a threat. This is a big threat. And what are they going to do? Bishop to e3. And this is actually a really annoying move to go against. And it's annoying because it's an easy one to spot as well. It's sort of the only thing that realistically defends the fork. And it's going to be really hard to kick this bishop away. So you're going to go bishop to f5. Bishop to g4 is tempting to create a pin, but don't bother with it. Bishop f5 is better because you're looking at this square as well. And you're looking at the bishop that could potentially block any checks. You sort of want a long castle. You want to get this bishop across. And that's about it. It can get quite complicated quite fast. And to be honest, I don't have the best record with this opening, with this gambit. So if you do want to play this, I would recommend looking this one up in particular. To learn from a better player on how to play this, because I'm not the best at this one. I will be dead honest with you guys. But these are the general ideas. You just want to sort of harass the king as much as possible, basically. And now, is there anything else? Knight f6, d4 we've covered. Knight c3 we've covered. c4 we've covered. Bishop b5 check is a big one. And if I wasn't to recommend c4, I would recommend this one, basically. This is what the better players will play. And I actually think it's what I think Daniel Naroditsky recommends to play against the Knight f6 Scandinavian. So, you've got to check. You've got to check. It's annoying. They want you to play c6. Do not play c6. It's super tempting. Do not play c6. It just doesn't work. You're down a pawn. And it's a worse version of the gambit we just looked at. You can play knight d7, but it's hard to play. It's hard to play. So I would recommend going bishop to d7. Now, again, there are more things white can do here. They can actually go to either of these three squares, and it's fine for them. If they go to c4, bishop g5 is the way to go, hitting the queen. And after an f3, you just go back to f5. So you go to either of these squares as well. They're going to either of these three. You go to either of these two. And you're all good. And you just sort of continue. You go knight to d7, and that stops any other checks as well. And then you're looking at like a knight to b6, just hitting this pawn again, hitting the bishop as well. And eventually you'll win it. It doesn't hold on to it for long. It does not hold on to it for long. So bishop to e2 is the other thing they can do. At this point, you could just take the pawn if you really felt that way. But bishop to f5, there is no need to take the pawn. If they try hold on to it, then you can play similar things to before. But you just take it. And then it actually sort of transposes into the other variation with knight to f6, f3 at the start, which is quite nice. They could go bishop to e2, bishop to f5, and they could throw in another check here. And you have to be aware of this because it is quite tricky. At this point, you're actually happy to block with your knight. And the bishop is a bit sort of stuck in the mud here. So then, and the pawn is under attack. They could move it back, but at which point knight to b6 is annoying. So they're just going to leave this here, and you're going to go knight to c3. They're going to go knight to c3, sorry. And then a6, you want to try free up your knight, so your knight can go to b6. Or anywhere else to free up your queen, basically. And yeah, the bishop's going to move eventually, knight b6, and then you win the pawn. So, yeah, I think the only thing you have to be aware of is like a c4 here. At which point, the c6 is better because the bishop's no longer there. And they've committed on the wing as well, so an e4 would take the space like we've seen in the other variation. Cool. I think that's everything. So we'll summarize again. All the things they can do here: push the pawn. They can play either knight out, or they could play a black Mardana gambit. So you've got to be aware of those. Knight f6. They have d4. They have either knight out again, and they have c4, and they have bishop check. So those are all the lines you need to know if you want to play this as your repertoire. Basically, you want to play this as your opening against e4. I would recommend doing research on your own, please. I'm not a particularly amazing source. This is stuff I play, so this is all from my studies that I've made and everything that I've written down. So it might not be completely computer accurate, but it is definitely good enough for at least 1500, 1600 potentially level. After that, you might need to supplement it with your own sort of stuff or other people's things. But I hope this video just sort of inspired you to take a look at it. I feel like the Scandinavian often gets overlooked because everyone expects to take with the queen. And knight f6 is a super fun alternative to taking with the queen. And the good thing about it is, other than these sort of 4 lines at the start that we've looked at, it's practically forced. You need to be aware of a few things white can do to shake things up. But to be honest, a lot of the time they transpose into each other. So it's super nice. You don't need to know much theory for it. You just need to know the general ideas. And it's fun as well. It's fun, especially if you like open positions with a lot of piece activity. It's a super fun opening. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this. Thank you all for watching. Please like if you liked. Please subscribe if you really liked. And I'll catch you guys all tomorrow. Bye-bye.